But question 5 is verse 16, and it says, "Greet one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ salute you." Now, the kiss, either in salutation or in parting, and I gave a couple of instances there from Genesis 31. Was common in ancient culture. Now, I want you to just think just for a moment, at what book did I cite with regard to the kiss of parting? What book did I cite? It's right there. No, where is it? Right there. The kiss and salutation or in parting. What's right after that? Genesis 31, y'all. That was not a trick question. Genesis 31. The reason I bring your attention to that is Genesis 31 is 2,000 years before Romans. And I bring your attention to that to show you that this form of greeting or separation, even in Romans 16, has been around for thousands of years and crosses numerous cultures and even continues today. You see there, particularly in the Middle East. My earliest memory of seeing this was as a boy, was watching Yasser Arafat in the 1970s, 1980s. He was the head of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He was a terrorist. But the point is that he was always on television. And you would always see these men greeting one another with a kiss on the cheek. Having been to Italy, it's still not as common, but still somewhat common, even in that particular culture. So I just want to establish the idea that this is not something that is at all uncommon and has literally been around for thousands of years. Third line, middle of it, there is nothing sexual involved in this practice. Jesus rebuked Simon the Pharisee for the lack of a kiss upon his own arrival. You remember when Jesus came and he went to the house of Simon the Pharisee and he sat down, and then the woman came in and washed his feet and dried her with her hair and the tears and Simon said, if this man was a prophet, he'd know what kind of woman this is, because she's a sinner. As if he wasn't. And Jesus said, "Simon," he said, "I have something to ask you." He said, "Say on." He said, "Well, when I came in," he said, you didn't wash my feet. You didn't even give me water to wash my own feet, and you gave me no kiss. In other words, you gave me no formal greeting." And so even Jesus rebuked a Pharisee for not greeting him in what would certainly be the customary fashion. He said, "You gave me no kiss." The kiss is best known probably in the New Testament as the means by which Judas betrayed the Lord. I mean, that of all the kisses in the Bible, that's probably, I would say, the most famous of all the kisses that are mentioned in all the pages of Scripture. Now, top of page 4. This is one of 4 epistles where Paul closes with a call for a holy kiss. 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians. Peter closed his first epistle with the admonition to greet one another with a kiss of love, 1 Peter 5 and verse 14. There is no consensus as to what is meant by these statements. In other words, Why were these statements made, and why don't they find them? For example, why don't they find themselves in all the letters? So so there's no real rhyme or reason as to why Paul said it 4 times and Peter this one time. Moses Lard, who was a really good Bible student in the 19th century, said the apostle did not create the custom because it was prevalent at the time. He meant merely to purify it. And there are others who wrote somewhat the same. McGarvey and Pendleton on their commentary on Romans said essentially the same thing. But I'm hesitant to embrace this idea, and here's why. There isn't any indication that the kiss needed to be purified. I have seen, that's in the next paragraph. I won't get too far away. To make a thing holy is to sanctify it or set it apart. That's what the word holy means. It just means something that has been set aside for a particular purpose. Of course, I put this last part because sometimes obviously minds don't think alike, and a person writes or intends one thing and I might interpret it as another. And so I said there's always the possibility that my understanding of what was meant by purify isn't the same as these men who penned these words over a century ago. In other words, McGarvey and Pendleton, those are our brethren. Moses Lard, our brethren. And so, but what they wrote 100 years ago might not mean the same when I'm reading it over 100 years later. So they may have meant something different than the way I understood it. So I just wanted to make that clear. Here's the one where I really have a problem. That some take it a step further, saying that the kiss had become inordinate, creating an unholy or lascivious atmosphere in the church. And this is from I took that from Brother Pollard in his Truth for Today commentary. And again, these are our people. These are our commentaries. But to me, this seems unlikely, as the practice was not only many centuries old, but it crossed geographical and cultural divides. It's difficult for me to consider that somehow only then was the kiss creating that type of problem in the church. In other words, here's something that's been going on for 4,000 years. And it's been going on in the far eastern part of the known world from the land of Abraham in modern day Iraq, and it's going on all the way in thousands of miles away in Rome, Italy. And so why would a practice that spans at least 2 millennia just now becoming a problem in like 3 or 4 locations? To me, it just doesn't make sense. So, in the context and in keeping with the language itself, I concur with the view that was expressed by Brother Jack Cottrell and others when he says that Paul is speaking generally of sincerity and fellowship. In other words, in whatever culture a person greets another, be it with a kiss, a hug, handshake, whatever, or even in a culture where an individual may bow, like in a Far Eastern type culture, that it should be done in genuineness and sincerity. Brother Howard Winters wrote that in his commentary on Romans there. In Galatians 2, Paul spoke of James, Peter, and John giving the right hand of fellowship to himself and to Barnabas. That is, there was a genuine appreciation and support by all brethren involved. And so I just added this, that may our greetings never be akin to the kisses of an enemy. That's from the book of Proverbs. It says, the wounds of a friend are faithful, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. In other words, a friend tells you the truth even if it hurts. But the enemy flatters you in deceit. And so we want to be, we want to be a people marked by sincerity, and genuineness. That's kind of I'm just speaking for me personally. It's kind of the beauty of what we have here, is that there's no putting on, there's no facade, there's no lack of sincerity. When people, when you see people come in this building and they shake hands and they hug or whatever, you know it's real. You know it's real. And people see that. They I hate to use this word, but there's just a good vibe, among the people here. You just feel it. You just sense it. And so, and we always want that to be the case. And if it were ever the case that if any of us ever had an issue with another one, that we could resolve that thing, and whatever that friction might be could be dissolved or dissipated, and nobody else would ever know it. And so, I think that's the real issue, or the issue. That's the real purpose of the statement is to be sincere, be without hypocrisy. Paul said, "Let love be without hypocrisy," or love is without hypocrisy. Then I want to talk about this phrase, the churches of Christ. The churches of Christ salute you, or all the churches of Christ salute you. Probably refers to the churches with whom Paul had visited or worked, if you remember from the previous chapter, from Jerusalem to Illyricum. In other words, Paul may be just giving a general, everywhere I've ever been, everywhere I've worked, they greet you. They greet you. The phrase should not be phrase church or churches of Christ should not be misinterpreted as some type of formal designation for the church, such as is known today in the United States and other places. The phrase Church of Christ, I'll give you in quotes there, small c church, big C Christ. All right. The phrase Church of Christ is found in religious literature from the post-Nicene writings, which post-Nicene would be early 4th century. Early Catholicism, you'll find the phrase Church of Christ throughout the entire Catholic Catechism. All the time that I've spent studying various things, and I have a copy of, I have an officially licensed, whatever you want to say, copy of the Catholic Catechism. And you'll find the phrase Church of Christ all the way through it. You can read the writings of the Reformation movement, which would be in the 16th centuries, in the 17th centuries. You're going to find the phrase Church of Christ. But obviously, all of those uses are not thinking about the same thing. I mean, like if you're talking about the Reformation movement and the Catholic Church says Church of Christ, and the Lutherans say Church of Christ, you know that the Catholics and the Lutherans are not talking about the same church. I just want you to understand this phrase is not it's not unique to the United States. It's not unique to American culture, and it is not the name of the church. It's not the name of the church. When Paul says the churches of Christ salute you, he's speaking of the one church established at Pentecost by our Lord following his earthly ministry, his death, his burial, his resurrection, and ascension. Church of Christ is a descriptive phrase rather than a prescriptive identification. In other words, it simply denotes the church that belongs to Christ. It's not the name that the Lord assigned for His people. And also incidentally, the literal rendering of this text is all the churches of the Christ. There is a definite article preceding the word Christ. All the churches of the Christ. All the churches of the Christ salute you or greet you. So let me just run a quick tangent here. If I'm writing a bulletin article, okay, or some type of manuscript, and I'm talking about the Church of Christ as the church that is read about in the New Testament, I'm going to write little C Church and big C Christ, okay? Because that's how if you're writing it or reading it from the Bible, that's how it would appear. But if I'm writing the Burleson Church of Christ, I'm going to put the word church in capital letters because it's proper English. You know, a lot of churches, when they write of, like, let's just say, if they were writing the Burleson Church of Christ, they would put little C Church, big B Burleson, little C Church, big C Christ. And the purpose of that is because they want to make sure that people understand that Church of Christ is not a denominational designation. But when I see it, it just says to me, your grammar's bad. Because the name Burleson Church of Christ is a formal name for this church. Look, ultimately it doesn't make any difference, all right? But I just want you to notice that if you see the name of a church and the church is little c, that's probably why that it is. I don't subscribe to that because I just think we need to write in proper English, because the name of this place is the Burleson Church of Christ. I mean, that's the legal description of this, of this body. And so thus I would just capitalize the whole thing. But I do appreciate the idea of trying to get away from a denominational designation of capital C Church and capital C Christ-like, and using that phrase in a denominational way. Like he's a Church of Christ preacher, or he's a Church of Christ. That's improper. It's an improper use of the phrase. It denominationalizes. By the way, in the American Restoration Movement, there were a number of different names that were being used by different men who were heading up various aspects of the Restoration Movement. For example, I believe, for some reason, I want to attribute one to each one because I'll get it wrong. But like Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone and some of these others, these men all were functioning unbeknownst to one another. But they were all teaching and practicing essentially the same thing because they were only going by the New Testament. Then when these individual movements began to grow, like Stone in Kentucky and Campbell in Pennsylvania or Ohio, when these men began to be known by one another, or to know of one another, they wanted to meet one another. Campbell and Stone had been working for decades separate from one another before I think they finally met one another maybe in the 1830s or the 1840s. And each of their particular movements, if I may use that term accommodatively, were being designated by different identifiers. One of them called themselves the Churches of Christ, and one of them called themselves the Disciples, and so the reason we have Church of Christ as our designation is simply for identification purposes. I mean, that's 100% it. There's no rule out there that has to be the name of the church. In fact, there are a number of designations biblically that the church could use. By the way, The church doesn't even have to have a designation. Doesn't even have to have a name. It could just be the church at Burleson. We could be the church at Burleson, and that'd be just as good as anything else. We could be the disciples at Burleson. We could be the Christians at Burleson. We could be, we could be the Church of God at Burleson. The Church of God's a biblical designation, scriptural designation. But again, it's not a name, it's just an identifier of people. And so any of those could be useful, but for the sake of avoiding confusion and knowing, for example, knowing where our people meet, we all essentially go by the same name. I've told y'all this before, but I'll just remind you. When I was working with House to House, Heart to Heart, we got a request from a congregation. I believe it was might have been in Virginia. I think it was in Virginia, and they wanted to use House to House, Heart to Heart, but when they wrote the name of the church, I think it was called the Church of Jesus Christ. The Church of Jesus Christ. And so, of course, one of my jobs used to be when you get odd looking requests, you investigate. So I called this guy and I said, "Hey, I'm with House to House, and we got your request to use it, but I got to ask you about the name, because by the way, a lot of denominations want to use House to House, Heart to Heart, but obviously we don't work with them." Or they don't work with them. And so I said, "What about this name?" He said, "We use the name the Church of Jesus Christ." He says, "Because every Church of Christ in our entire county and in the surrounding area that has the name Church of Christ uses instrumental music." He said, "And we don't want to be associated with them. So we changed our name so that people wouldn't confuse us with them." I said, "Good enough. We'll get you signed up." But I just simply tell you that to let you know that any designation that is scriptural can be used, but we use what we do to avoid confusion. I mean, if our sign out front said Burleson Church of God, or the Burleson Assembly of God, or the Church of the Firstborn, we'd probably get some interesting inquiries. See Jeremiah laughing back there. All right, so. The Trace. I mean, they can do whatever they want. Now, now look, and I will say this, Daniel, since you brought that up, there are, and I'm not saying this is true of them. I'm just simply.
I went through a couple of times. I didn't agree with the teachings, but I know that they was going from Church Christ to just the Trace.
Yeah, there are those. Again, I'm not talking about the Trace, but just by way of example, because I don't know anything about them. There are some congregations of the Churches of Christ that are getting away from the name Church of Christ, but the reason for that is they're getting away from the doctrine of the New Testament. There's one on the right when you get down to about Prattville, great big one right there on the right. I can't even remember the name of it, but it's got the name in big letters, and then underneath it says A Church of Christ. Here's our name, but we're kind of ashamed but we're going to go ahead and tag this at the bottom. And so again, I'm not saying that's true of them. I'm just saying some churches are doing that. Like the church from Max Lucado, they got rid of their designation years ago, which is a good thing because they don't believe or teach anything remotely akin to,
I learned that lesson when I was little. My friends that said that's Church of Christ, and Mom and Dad let me go with them.
Yeah.
It's Holy Church of Christ. And everybody was they had instruments, and I told them, man, this ain't Church of Christ. Some one of their hymns said, "You feel the Spirit of it on regular Church of Christ."
I'm the normal. I'm regular. All right. Now, also one more thing above number 6, the Greek word rendered church is found in vastly different contexts in the New Testament. It just simply means a called out or separated assembly. For example, in Acts 19:32, it is used to describe a gathering or an assembly, New King James, in Ephesus that ended up in a riot. And it didn't have anything to do with the people involved being members of the body of Christ. So it's a descriptive term and not a prescribed name for the body of Christ. All right, so any thoughts or anything that they want to add to that? All right, bottom of page 4, question 6, verse 17. Now I urge you, brethren, what? Note or mark those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you have learned, and avoid them. This is one of those passages of Scripture that people think, sometimes they think, this must have been added later, or it's not, this doesn't seem to fit the theme. Maybe somebody added this because it's so contrary to the context. This is one of those, because the preceding verses are notices of whom to greet, and then the following 4 verses after verses 17 to 20 are people who are sending greetings. In other words, greet these people, and then the next half is these people greet you. And so, but note the top of page 5. It says, it's not inconsistent at all with Paul's closing statements in other epistles. Both Corinthian letters, Galatians, and both Thessalonian letters all contain similar warnings to protect local unity by guarding against false teachers and others who might bring division. Cottrell also notes that in speaking of all the churches of Christ in verse 16, Paul is implying the unanimity of the faith and practice, among the churches in the East where he had labored. The phrase, I urge you, brethren, is identical in its construction to I beg you, brethren, in verses in 15:30, and is nearly identical to I beseech you, therefore, brethren, in Romans 12 and verse 1. So it kind of gives you the context of what Paul is, the urgency of what Paul is talking about. Note also, second paragraph, Paul's command to note those who cause divisions and offenses. To note means to be watchful and vigilant. Now, there doesn't appear to be an active threat to the church at that time, but Paul knew that such a day would come, as it does essentially to every church at some point. In other words, like for example, when you read some of Paul's letters to Timothy or to other churches, other congregations in other cities, Paul would be specific about such and such teaches this, avoid them. Such and such did this to me. When Paul writes about this, he doesn't identify anybody in particular. So it kind of leads me to believe he's preparing them. It's not that there's a problem, but he knows that there will be a problem, because throughout history, almost every single congregation has run into problems with division. And that division oftentimes is marked by false teaching, but also sometimes it's marked by pride and selfishness. In other words, people divide not over matters of doctrine, but over matters of personality. Now, look, neither one of those things is good. Somebody's always in the. Anytime there's a church division, somebody has sinned. It's like there's no such thing as a sinless church division. Kind of like there's no such thing as a sinless divorce. One person might be innocent, but there's somebody sinning, right? That the sinless divorce does not exist. There's a sin on the part of one or the other or both. Same goes with church divisions and various schisms. Now, note here the last paragraph, and we'll stop here. It says, divisions and offenses is from the word meaning dichotomy and scandal. Now, dichotomy means two things that are in opposition to one another. And of course, we all know what a scandal is. And of course, we don't want to retrofit our understanding of the word scandal back to the Greek. We want to use the original, and understand it properly. But a scandal in this case, well, first of all, dichotomy is disunion involving two things that cannot be reconciled: good and evil, light and dark, order and chaos. And in this case, a scandal is a snare or an occasion to fall. Those who would teach anything contrary to the doctrine they had learned was to be avoided at all cost. The word here means to shun or go out of the way. It says to avoid them. In other words, to make a long, if you're going and you got to go all the way around, make it obvious that you're trying to stay away from this type of individual. Psalm 1 speaks to this. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, stands in the seat of sinners, or sits in the seat of the scornful. In other words, he's among them. We want to be the people that avoid those types of individuals. There was a sense, if I remember correctly, there was a sense in which this word avoid was somewhat like if there's somebody that's causing divisions or scandals, whatnot, in the church, is that you put your hand up. They're trying to talk to you, but you put your hand up and you go around. In other words, you let them know in no uncertain terms, I'm not interested in anything you have to say. I'm keeping you at arm's length and my hand is up, meaning you be quiet. I'm not listening to you. That's the idea, I think, that's conveyed, if I remember one of the commentaries that I had read. Paul opens his Galatian epistle with a curse on anyone, including an angel from heaven, who taught a different gospel than the one they had received. And he said it twice in verses 6 through 10. And so we're to note and avoid those who cause divisions or lay snares or occasion of stumbling or falling. All right, Lord willing, next, will be April the 1st. Is that right? Is that right? All right. We'll pick up there.